This section is for Spring Boot CRUD. That means create, read, update, and delete. We want Spring Boot REST API to do the CRUD for the data in database with Spring Data JPA Hibernate. Recall from the previous section, the demo Hibernate project that we worked on. We already have the code for the all or read of the CRUD. That means the getAll method annotated with the request mapping. The code used the student repo.findAll to read all records of the students. By default, request mapping is for getRequest. In fact, it can be specified like this. Get mapping, this is the shortcut for getRequest. But we just leave it as it was as before. Now let's code the C, create of the CRUD. We want to insert the student into the student database table. To create or insert the student, all we need to do is to create a method, add student, like this. For the method add student, we need to use add post mapping annotation /add to annotate it. That means for the HTTP post request, this add student method in this student controller class will take care of it. When create a student record, the user needs to pass in a student object. That's what this parameter student in does. We need to use the annotation add request body to indicate it. For the passed in student in object, we use the auto-wide object student repo to save it. Please note, the student repo.save in the student repo class, let's open it. In the student repo interface, it does not define the save method or any other methods. It's the extended interface JPA repository that does all the magic for us. It defines the save method and the other CRUD methods in it. That's the power of JPA. But we need to supply the entity class name, and in our case here is student, and the key ID type in our case here is long. So basically, we only need to create this add student method code in the student controller class, and we reuse the student repo code created in previous section. But we don't change anything here. Let's have a run and test it. Start the project. We can first test the all or read with the get request. GetAll is the method for read, and the request mapping by default is the get request for the method GetAll. Let's go to a browser and type localhost :8080/all and hit enter. We see we have one record, John Smith, here. So we can use this URL to test read from the browser. Now, how do we test create? How to insert a student record into the student table in database with the endpoint URL? If we change this URL for get request, the localhost :8080/all to /add, this is the URL for the post request for create. Can we use this URL and test it from the browser? The answer is no. The method add student with its annotation post mapping defines an API endpoint to create a student. It requires a passing object. In our case here is student in. To test this type of endpoint APIs, we need a API client tool. Postman is one of the tools. Postman is a platform for testing endpoint APIs. It's very easy to install and use. Just go to our browser. On the Google search, type Postman download, and click first one, download Postman from the postman.com, and drag down a little bit. So this Windows 64-bit is the installer. We'll assume we are using Windows, so click it to download. In few seconds, it's downloaded the installer. So once it's complete, we can click the installer to start downloading, installing. It's installing. Okay, come to the page. It prompts us to create an account, but to use Postman, we don't have to create an account. If we can see at the bottom, skip, and go to the app. So we can click that one, then go to the app. We can start using it. If we close it, we can see the installed Postman icon already on the desktop. This is the installer. We can delete right now. We just delete. Yes, delete it. This is the icon for the Postman. We can double click and reopen it. See, it's opened. So we can start use Postman from here. Now let's test the code with Postman. First we start the project. Okay, project started on port 880. Then go to Postman. You see a plus sign here. We click this plus sign, and we want to do a get query, and we want to see what's inside the student table for now. So we use localhost column 8080 /or, then click send, and then we see we have one record, which is John Smith. Then we want to test the post request to add or create the student record. So we use the localhost 8080 /add, and we want to click body here and raw and text JSON format, and we want to put the JSON format student record to be added right here. And please note, we use the name Mary Brown, email mary.brown@gmail.com. We don't specify the ID here. Why? Because in student class, the ID is the primary key. It's annotated with generated value strategy equal to generate type.auto. The primary ID will be, the key ID will be generated by the Spring Boot data JPA. Okay, back to Postman. With this record specified in JSON format, name and email, we with the post request and the URL, we click send. Now we see the result has been generated for Mary Brown. Now we want to verify it's really created. We do the get request again and do a query ADD/all and click the send, and then now we see we have two records. Mary Brown, the student record, has been generated successfully. Need to point out, when we send a post request for the create URL, we need to select body, raw, and the JSON format. The record typed in is in JSON format. It's the annotation request body that helped convert the JSON format record into the Java object. In our case, is a student in. Next, we'll do update. Mary changed her last name from Mary Brown to Mary Smith. All we need to do is to create a method update student like this. Here's the update student method. For this update method, we need to use the annotation put mapping with the ID in braces. To pass this ID to the method, we need to pass variable with value equal to ID. This ID and this ID, these two names have to match. And we also need to define the type for this ID. Since it's long, we define it long, and we need to define the name as a student ID here. The student ID is the key. We're not going to change the key. The updates we want to make is for the object properties pointed to by this key, student ID. All the changes passed in are in this student in object, and we need to annotate it with request body, same as before in added student. We need to annotate it with a request body. Whenever we pass a body in, we need to use the request body. Please note, we are talking about the two student objects here. The one in database that needs to be updated, and the one passed in with the new changes. That's the student in object. We need to fetch the one in database for the update. To do that, we use the method find student by ID of the student repo. Please note, we used find all method and save method of student repo before, but in student repo, let's open it. In student repo, we don't see the two methods defined here. Why? Because the extended JPA repository has taken care of the two. But for find student by ID method, we need to define the method in student repo like this. We just need to specify the find method name and the ID of the object to look for and the return type of the object. And we also need to use the optional here, because there could be a case nothing is found. Back to the controller. We see once we specify the method, the find method in student repo, this find student by ID becomes valid, no longer red. For find student by ID call, if it succeeds, it will return a student object. What if fail? If it fails, we use method chaining dot or else throw. Use exception handling by throwing a student not found exception object. We need to create this class student not found exception. So we right click on the package, say new class, and then the name is student not found exception, and hit enter. and needs to extends runtime time exception, and create the constructor like this. We need to annotate this class with the response status, so the Spring Boot exception handler, the default handler, will handle the throw exception. Back to student controller. The code is all good now. The code below, we update the object fetched from the database and set the email to the value passed from the passed in as student in object. Also set the name as the passed in name. We use the student repo.save to save the student back, the updated student object back to database. And then we use the shortcut response entity.ok, the static method call, to create the new object response entity with returned student updated, and set the status as OK. Okay, now let's run and test it. Click run here. Okay, now started on 8080. Let's use the Postman, and we click this plus sign and type localhost colon 8080/all, and we use get request and make sure all the records are still there. Yes, we see 2 records, John Smith and Mary Brown. Looks good. Now we want to make a update. Let's say Mary Brown changed her last name from Brown to Smith, become Mary Smith, and the Gmail also need to be changed to mary.smith@gmail.com. How can we do that? We use the put request and /2, that's the ID we need to pass in. Then we need to, let me drag this down a little bit. We need to click body raw. We need to pass the updates object with the updates, and then we use the JSON format, and we pass in the record as with the ID 2, and to change it to Mary Smith. And in the database currently is still Mary Brown, so we want to change it to Mary Smith. This is the pass-in object. So we click send. Okay, look like it's updated. To make sure it's updated, we go back to get, to query all, and of course we need to change, make sure it's click the params in the Postman, and click send, and let's see. Yes, the second record, Mary Brown, has been changed to Mary Smith, and the Gmail as well. We have 2 records in the table in database. What would happen if we type the wrong ID? Previously we tried to update the second record, type in the ID as 2. What happens if we type 3? Let's say we go to put, and we type 3, and we use body also raw, type JSON, and we still here we use the correct one. Let's say we want to change it back to Mary Brown. We want to change it back to Mary Brown. But we by mistake we type 3. What would happen? So we click send, we get 44 status code with the error not found. That's Spring Boot exception, the default exception handler. The exception handler the default exception handler in Spring Boot will display a not found when it cannot find. This ID is not found by this method, and it throws all else throw. But we provided the new the exception object with the student not found for this ID. We passed in ID message, but this message is not displayed. See, the message is not here. The error is shown. That's good. Not found. The ID 3 is not found, but the message not showing. How to solve this problem? To display the customized message, this message here with the student ID, we need to go to the application properties file and add this line here. We need to add server.error.include-message equal to always. So if once we include this line, and let's rerun this code when the server is up, so we go to Postman and we can do it again. See, note currently we only have timestamp status error path. Let's see what happens now. We do this. See, we see message student not found for this ID 3. That's the ID 3 we passed in. This time sees the message with the line defined in the property files. Okay, the last of the CRUD, delete. We need to create a method delete student like this. For this delete student method, we need to annotate it with add delete mapping with the argument /delete/id here. We also can add the annotation transactional. By default, the transactional will roll back if there is a runtime exception. Same as before, we need to use path variable and make sure this ID and this ID they match each other. And then we define a delete method, delete student by ID for student repo right from here. There was no such method in student repo before. Let's take a look. There's no delete method before. Now we define the ID right from here. Then we can use the shortcut Alt Shift Enter. Sorry. Okay. So once we do that, then the delete student by ID method generated automatically. Then we go back to controller. Please note, the format of this delete method needs to be delete, then the entity name, then by ID, then the ID, the key ID field passed in. Okay, now let's run and test it. Click run. Okay, the project is started. Now let's go to Postman, and we click the plus, and we use localhost 8080/all. We want to make sure we still have the records. Okay, we have 2 records. We have the John Smith and Mary Brown. Okay, now we want to delete let's say we want to delete Mary Brown. So we use delete request, and we use the delete the ID is 2, so we use 2 here, and we click send. Okay, looks good. So we go back and check, make sure we do the select again and see if it's deleted or not. So it used to be 2, now we say send. Now we only have 1, so Mary Brown has been deleted successfully. Okay, so in summary, we have to walk through the code for all the CRUD operations. We worked on C, or create or add with post request. Then we worked on R, or read or select or get all with get request. The request mapping by default is get request. Then we worked on U, update with the put request. Then we worked on D, delete with delete mapping, delete request. For good practice in Spring Boot development, we normally use 4-layer architecture. To simplify the code, here we didn't use the 4-layer architecture. We just try to make it easy to understand how CRUD operations work here. We'll talk about the 4 layers architecture and more on others in later sections.